Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to University of Graz, Faculty of Law, even if only virtually. Allow me to start by apologizing. This event is running late, not in the sense that academic events tend to run late as a matter of course. A couple of minutes of tardiness that would self-complacently highlight the laid-back atmosphere that distinguishes academia from other typically more result-driven walks of life. No, this event is running late because it was scheduled to take place about a year ago here on site at the faculty. And of course, I was hoping when planning this, it would draw a large crowd from all over the world to discuss something we may consider to be of common importance, the state of constitutionalism and the question of how matters would unfold. Then, of course, how matters actually did unfold took most of us, me at least, quite by surprise. And what happened next was as easily to be foreseen as it was bound to fail. The event was postponed at first to October 2020. At the time, the decision was made just to be on the safe side of things. And then again to this date, this time just to be cocksure that things would go as planned. Another fool's errand, of course, as it rather quickly turned out, as life tends to get in the way of the best of predictions. A lesson, I guess, that we all had to learn the hard way over the last year, and a lesson that also did underline a truism many of us should have internalized by now. Because, let's be honest, whenever did postponing something resolve anything? And so, and with a somewhat heavy heart, we decided to go through with this endeavor also, and in particular, because what we discuss today is not only of common importance, it is also somewhat urgent. After all, constitutionalism is in crisis. Everybody, it seems, says so, even if for different reasons. And of course, the current pandemic only makes things worse. Again, everybody seems to say so, even if for different reasons. Values, once taken for granted, seem to be cavalierly discarded. Pictures that remind us of a past many of us don't even remember accompany our daily lives. And whatever is happening at the moment to affirm such a dim view, it's not just happening elsewhere. It's happening right here, or in any event, somewhere close in neighboring countries, across an entire region, on a global scale, as some of us fear. Of course, to emphasize this runs the risk of stating the obvious, nowadays at least, when every second article, monograph or edited volume in the field seems to lament this fact. And of course, this illusion, if not worse, seems warranted. The edifice of constitutionalism, object of widespread admiration and firm support in a not-too-distant past, seems somewhat dilapidated, if not overall, partially at the very least. This condition, it appears to me, has essentially been brought about by three distinct, even if interdependent, causes. First, the foundation on which the concept of constitutionalism rests have been weakened. In some communities, it seems, democracy has successfully parted ways with liberalism, and those responsible for it are not even ashamed to admit as much. The rule of law is threatened by political actors who openly call for expedience to take precedence over legality. Power sharing within larger entities seems to have lost its appeal, with newly established polities crumbling and century-old commonwealths on the brink of dissolution, making way for what appeared to be smaller and smaller communities, thereby crushing the hopes of those who thought regional federalization would pave the way for true global governance. Then again, the building blocks of constitutionalism are threatened by corrosion far too often, and in far too cavalier a manner. Human rights are held in disregard, if not in disrepute, when the going gets tough. The tough then, of course, get going, but they seem to wander further and further from the basic principles of liberty and equality in dignity that traditionally served as the tenets of a right to have rights, as it has shaped our understanding of the normative implications of our shared humanity. At the same time, the will of the international community to hold those responsible whose deeds caused suffering beyond repair seems to fade, while globalization in general and global trade in particular far more often are perceived as a problem than as the solution they seemed to offer only a decade ago. A world which we were taught to and were used to perceive as becoming smaller and smaller now seems to expand, placing things that seemed within our grasp out of reach. And finally, those in charge of maintaining and enlarging the edifice of constitutionalism nowadays do not necessarily appear to be up to the job. Formal state and interstate institutions are often tainted by appearing partisan, prejudiced, and in any case falling short of effectively pursuing the common good and the promise it holds for the community, no matter its size. Political parties, that is, traditional political parties, seem to have lost not only their appeal to, but also the trust of their former followers, who appear just too willing to follow those who either offer easy solutions for complex problems or stand in the way for what seem to be easy solutions, complicating matters by fabrications that keep their machinery going. With the trust in parties, their ability to serve as a pillar of liberal democracy faded. Ever new popular movements seem on the rise, riding the waves of public opinion only to be washed away by the tide of challenges that seem to change with heightened frequency every now and then. As gloomy as the picture thus drawn may seem, let's be honest, nothing about this is particularly new. We know that. We have seen it on the news. We have read it in the paper. We have endured it on social media. And all of these phenomena have been subjected to extensive academic scrutiny. And to do so, yet again, may have only minor appeal. But where does the charted road lead? After all, we cannot, in good conscience, accept the state of the constitutionalist enterprise as a given. And we cannot, in good faith, think of it as something that strives towards perfection as a matter of course. Constitutionalism and its effects on a national, a regional, and a global scale has always been nothing short of an achievement that, if contrasted with the vast part of human history, proved to be truly exceptional in more than one meaning of the term. An exceptional achievement that, more often than not, came at the price of struggle, suffering, and despair. And while we thus may analytically distinguish select constitutions along all sorts of typically binary categories such as flexible or rigid to refer to only one, even if particularly well-established take, politically, the constitutionalist project as such, no matter its scale, may adequately only be described by a single attribute. It is fragile, ever dependent on certain conditions to be met, and ever dependent on the will to meet them. Constitutionalism, to put it in the words of Dieter Grimm, is not guaranteed forever, just as it emerged at a certain historical moment, under certain historical conditions. It can also disappear or change its meaning if these conditions are no longer given or largely modified. But is that bound to happen to global constitutionalism, or in any event to constitutionalism globally? Nobody knows, of course. But at the same time, nobody seems keen to make an educated guess either. And that is somewhat surprising. After all, it was Oliver Wendell Holmes who taught us that studying the law, the object of our study is prediction. So wouldn't we expect scholars professionally preoccupied with the constitutionalist enterprise in its various forms to predict how events will unfold? Of course, those familiar with Holmes's work and the influence it exerted on various strands of legal scholarship, they would interject that the predictions Holmes had in mind, if we in fact were to agree what Holmes exactly had in mind, were limited in scope when compared to the task of predicting the future development of constitutionalism on a national, a regional, or a global level. That may well be the case. And still, it is not to say that an endeavor on this scale may not be worthwhile. It was, after all, no less a scholar of constitutionalism than Bruce Ackerman who opened his seminal essay on the rise of global constitutionalism by asking the reader to turn back the clock 60 years and glimpse into the future. What, so Ackerman wondered, were the prospects for constitutionalism as they might have appeared in the late 1930s? And so, why not glimpse into the future? Not by looking back on a particular point of history, marveling at the unexpected turn of events, but by actually looking ahead in an effort to determine the causes and effects of a process that, as matters stand, is bound to bring about a particular outcome. This is, of course, not a simple task. As the popular saying, attributed variously to Niels Bohr, Mark Twain, and others goes, it is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And while one should not shy away from a task simply because it's difficult, it is important to emphasize that predicting necessarily asks for more than to engage in a mere guessing game. It is an endeavor based on law and fact, an endeavor that requires both expertise and experience, just as it requires an adequate frame of reference for them to be put to somewhat good use. Thus, the first task to be accomplished was to create a framework that would allow to comprehensively approach the task at hand. Comprehensive is not to say, however, that such an enterprise would aspire to be exhaustive. What it intends to do is to connect select threads of the phenomenon of a crisis of constitutionalism on its various stages, or what is perceived as such a crisis, to a tightly woven net that may prove to be a sufficiently robust basis for any further discussion of the topic. The causes for the current state of affairs, as outlined a couple of minutes ago, they seem to offer a good starting point to do so, not least because of their respective point of reference. The way they are arranged, they each focus on different layers, we may say, of the problem described as a crisis of constitutionalism. And these layers may be described for the purpose of our endeavor as aspects, areas, and actors. Aspects that focus on select structural principles underlying constitutionalism on the national and on the international level. Areas that focus on select fields of international law, particularly significant for constitutionalism on a global level, and on their influence on national law. And actors that focus on key agents that shape the state of constitutionalism on the national and on the international level. The classification thus introduced should allow to address the problem from various angles. This, again, may serve as the necessary precondition for getting a fuller picture of the phenomenon at hand, to ensure that the layers themselves are subdivided in distinct fields. The aspects we focus on will be democracy, the rule of law, and federal integration, if you will. The areas we will discuss will be international human rights, international criminal law, and global trade. And finally, the actors put in the spotlight of our investigations will be institutions, parties, and, of course, popular movements. It is, of course, evident that the framework itself, as well as its particular subfields, may be challenged, or at least may be questioned in one part or another. After all, why put an emphasis not on the limited executive rather than on federalism? Why not focus on international environmental law instead of international criminal law? Of course, one may argue that the subfields so defined are widely perceived to be the essential building blocks of the constitutional project in a global perspective, putting aside the specific take on this project, which is, of course, subject to dispute. Addressing concerns such as the status of the individual, the interrelation of legality and legitimacy, the interaction between various political entities, broadly understood, the standards both globally and on the national level these entities have to meet, and the forces, of course, that shape the process on various levels. Still, challenges to the adequacy of the field selected may never be met, I guess, in a perfectly satisfying manner. At the same time, well, maybe they needn't be, so long as the overall impression of the subject thus offered is to be considered insightful. So, while each of the 9 fields thus defined is to be studied separately in order to allow for a prediction as to its future development, the contrast with the other fields will add to the comprehensive understanding of how the crisis of constitutionalism will, or rather may, unfold in the global perspective the project strives to achieve. Not to be misunderstood, this comprehensive understanding, it may be completely off. Reality, as indicated before, tends to get in the way of even the best of predictions. But that, again, does not make the endeavor a futile effort. On the contrary, it may underline just how important it is. After all, if those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it, those that fail to concern themselves with the future are doomed to just let it take its course. And that just doesn't seem tempting. And after all, Even those like Jack Balkin, who follow in the footsteps of Polybius and Machiavelli by setting out to measure constitutional time in recurring cycles, they freely admit that constitutionalism, it will not take care of itself, but it is in need of action on its behalf. A sober look at the current state of affairs and how it will evolve given how matters stand, thus does not ensure that things will turn out as predicted, particularly, I may add, if it is well done. Because if it is well done, it is more likely that action is taken on its basis. Action that, in turn, may prove the prediction wrong. That happening may indeed be the most gratifying outcome. That is to say, if the outlook presented is grim in any case. Still, we must not overrate the effects of an academic endeavor like ours, at least the effect it can possibly yield. Conferences like the one we have here today, for various reasons, I guess, are ill-suited to provide a forum for agitation. What they can do is to provide a solid foundation for conclusions to be drawn and action to be taken. If that were to be the case, even if to the most negligible extent, this would be no small achievement. In order to hedge our bets, however, it certainly is of great use to the comprehensive understanding to be developed by way of contrast, not to be cast in the same mold by a single individual, no matter his sense of mission, but rather to be compiled by a group of scholars who are offered the flexibility necessary to independently engage in predictions for the respective field over a certain period of time. And 10 years seemed quite reasonable for that, even though the last year did prove authoritatively that even a single year's course may be impossible to predict. Which is why today, indeed, we're talking about the state of constitutionalism in 2030. Of course, the flexibility thus offered has to put up with different methodological approaches as well as with differing emphasis. This is not necessarily a weakness. Quite on the contrary, with fields of inquiry so loosely defined, it is inevitable to place an emphasis on particular questions. That is, if the prediction is not to be lost in intangible abstractions. And certainly, the questions before us well nigh beg to be addressed not only in a doctrinal perspective, but to be answered in a transdisciplinary manner. Embracing jurisprudence, just as political science, or lessons to be learned from a governance perspective, and thereby, if nothing else, documenting the rich variety of the contemporary discourse on constitutionalism. Of course, even a number of scholars and a variety of perspectives will not provide a safeguard against missing the mark. To be sure, we must come to terms with the possibility that some, if not all, of the predictions we set out to make today may not fall victim to their own success, but rather prove to be plain wrong. Still, even then, I wouldn't consider our undertaking a failure. Much rather, I think, this would invite us to ask the same questions anew once the answers have been proven wrong, and to do so again thereafter. Thus, in order to assess the damage they have done, the 9 scholars participating in the project need to be willing to review and revise their predictions after 10 years, and then again 10 years later, nothing less. I have to confess against this background that I'm still somewhat amazed by the fact that indeed 9 scholars, some of whom I have the privilege to consider close friends now for many years, all of them experts in their various fields, have agreed to join me in this endeavor and to make not only a prediction as to the development of a certain field for the next decade, but to publish it in order to revise it 1 or 2 decades later, and thus to overall produce 3 volumes on the subject. The first of which, Constitutionalism 2030, is to be published by the end of the year. The plan then is, of course, to gather here in Graz again, 2030, this time around actually on site, or so I hope, to make predictions on how things will look in 2040, only to meet up then again to give it another, even if, I guess, final go. I am honestly grateful to them for having accepted my invitation and for not having shied away from the rather long-term commitment involved in our common endeavor. As I'm grateful to Hart Publishing for having readily agreed to include this somewhat unusual series in their program. But for today, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by thanking you for joining us remotely from so many parts of the world in such a large number. Believe me when I say that in a time of ubiquitous Zoom fatigue, that neither I nor my fellow speakers take your virtual presence for granted. And we want to make good use of it by cordially inviting you not only to listen in, but to join our discussions today. So please feel free to interject or ask questions anytime using the chat function of your platform. I will keep a close watch on it and faithfully will forward your remarks to our speakers at the end of each panel for a joint discussion, knowing that our predictions can only benefit from your insights. Thank you, and thank you for joining us in the discussion in advance. And finally, welcome to Constitutionalism 2030.